If police are biased toward people of color, are people of color biased toward police? Does it matter? The American conversation about race and policing has intensified over the past decade, shaped by viral videos, federal investigations, litigation, and calls for structural reform. At the center of this discourse lies a fundamental question: are police officers biased toward people of color? Scholars have examined racial disparities in stops, searches, arrests, use of force, charging decisions, and sentencing outcomes. Constitutional litigation has focused on equal protection claims, discriminatory intent standards, and Fourth Amendment reasonableness. Yet this conversation, though critical, tends to operate in one direction. It asks whether bias flows from police toward communities. It rarely asks whether bias, or more precisely, distrust, generalized suspicion, or negativity may also flow from communities toward police. This omission obscures a key operational reality. Policing is interactive. But does understanding contemporary policing challenges require examining reciprocity? If officers may approach encounters with cognitive associations shaped by experience, residents may also approach encounters with expectations shaped by history, media narratives, and collective memory. These expectations influence tone, compliance, reporting behavior, and willingness to cooperate. 3 propositions guide this analysis. 1. Bias is a universal cognitive phenomenon shaped by environment and experience. 2. Reciprocal distrust between police and minority communities is empirically plausible and sociologically measurable. 3. Even where power asymmetries differ, reciprocal distrust affects public safety outcomes. The goal is not to create moral equivalence between institutional bias and community skepticism. The power differential between police and civilians remains legally and normatively significant. Rather, the goal is to examine whether reciprocal distrust influences legitimacy, compliance, and crime reduction. Cognitive bias and decision-making under stress. Cognitive science demonstrates that human beings rely on mental shortcuts, referred to as heuristics, to process information quickly. Under conditions of uncertainty and stress, reliance on such shortcuts increases. Law enforcement is structurally characterized by ambiguity, potential danger, and time pressure. Officers must make rapid judgments about threat, intent, and credibility. Research on implicit bias suggests that automatic associations may influence perception in split-second contexts. However, laboratory findings do not automatically translate to field behavior. Officer decision-making is constrained by departmental policy, training, supervisory review, and legal standards. Nonetheless, it is widely accepted that no human population is immune from cognitive bias. Community-level bias formation. If officers develop schemas based on repeated exposure to crime patterns, residents may also develop schemas based on repeated exposure to enforcement practices. In neighborhoods experiencing frequent stops or highly publicized misconduct, distrust may become culturally embedded. Sociologist Robert Sampson's concept of legal cynicism captures this orientation in adaptive cultural frame in which law and its agents are perceived as illegitimate or ineffective. Legal cynicism is not simply individual prejudice. It is a collective response to structural conditions. It shapes how residents interpret police presence. An officer's patrol may be viewed as protective in one neighborhood and intrusive in another. Understanding bias as a human condition. Bias, in its broadest sense, refers to mental shortcuts and assumptions formed through experience, culture, media exposure, and social learning. All human beings develop cognitive associations. These associations are not always conscious, and they are not always malicious. Police officers operate in environments characterized by repeated exposure to crime and violence, high-risk encounters, stress and ambiguity, and rapid threat assessment. Community members in high police contact neighborhoods may operate under very different but equally powerful influences. personal or secondhand experiences of perceived mistreatment stories passed through families and neighborhoods, media narratives about police misconduct or historical grievances tied to race and law enforcement. Both officers and residents are shaped by lived experience. Bias, therefore, can develop in both directions. The professional reality is this: acknowledging that community bias toward police may exist does not excuse officer misconduct. Nor does acknowledging officer bias dismiss legitimate community grievances. The question is not about blame, it is about operational effectiveness. If policing requires public cooperation, then perceptions matter as much as policy. If legitimacy is a force multiplier, then mutual distrust is a force reducer. If police are biased towards people of color, that is a serious concern that must be addressed through training, policy, supervision, and culture. But if people of color are biased toward police, that reality also shapes outcomes. It affects cooperation, compliance, and officer safety. Does it matter? Absolutely, because policing is relational. Public safety depends not only on law enforcement authority, but on public confidence. When either side operates from assumption rather than understanding, legitimacy weakens. When legitimacy weakens, safety declines, for officers and communities alike. The bottom line is this: if police are biased toward people of color, constitutional reform is necessary. If people of color are biased toward police, relational repair is necessary. Both realities may coexist. The question is not whether bias exists in only one direction. The question is whether legitimacy can be strengthened despite structural asymmetries and historical mistrust. Modern-day bias is most likely to take the form of implicit bias. Implicit biases are similar to explicit biases in that the biased person links individuals to stereotypes or generalizations associated with their group or groups. But unlike explicit biases, implicit biases are not based on animus or hostility, and these implicit associations can impact perceptions and behavior outside of conscious awareness. Even individuals who, at the conscious level, reject prejudice and stereotyping can and do manifest implicit biases. Social psychologists lament that public policy has not been in sync with the science of bias. As two researchers on the psychology of prejudice, Curtis Hardin and Mazarin Banaji, report, personal and public policy discussions regarding prejudice and discrimination are too often based on an outdated notion of the nature of prejudice. This has been true in policing as well as other professions. Police and community members alike envision the racial profiler as an ill-intentioned individual who harbors hostility towards certain groups and is unconcerned about his or her discriminatory behavior or its effects. Dushaw Hockett is the founder and executive director of Safe Places for the Advancement of Community and Equity, a Washington, D.C.-based leadership development and technical assistance organization dedicated to bridging the gap between what people imagine and what they achieve. A native New Yorker who now resides in Maryland, Dushaw has over 20 years of experience in training, community building, and organizational development. Let's listen to his TED Talk titled, "We All Have Implicit Biases, so what can we do about it?"
I want to make an argument to you. I want to make a case to you. And the argument that I want to make is that the way that we currently think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. The way we think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. And in making this case, I want to build on the very robust and compelling evidence that has been coming out of the science community for the past 10 plus years that suggests that if we want to move to a radically different place, a radically better place on issues of race and difference in this country, we have to pay attention to something called implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? Oprah Winfrey has talked about it. Malcolm Gladwell has written about it. Normally we say when Oprah is talking about it and Malcolm is writing about it, everybody knows about it, which isn't always the case. So a bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a person or a group of people. There are three characteristics that make a bias implicit. Characteristic number one, implicit biases operate at the subconscious level, outside of conscious awareness. We don't know that we have them, and they can't be accessed through introspection. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that none of us can sit here in this room right now, scratch our heads, and wonder out loud, do I have a bias against men, against women, against black people, against white people, against immigrants, and expect to accurately answer that question, because the nature of an implicit bias is such that we don't know that we have them. Characteristic number two, implicit biases oftentimes run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs about who we are as human beings and what our values are. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that you can be a school administrator and say that you are deeply committed to nurturing and building up young people, and yet be the same school administrator who leads your school in high rates of suspensions and expulsions of young people. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to building young people up. Unconsciously, you're doing harm in the process. The science of implicit bias says that you can be a law enforcement officer deeply committed to the mantra that appears on the side of police vehicles that says what? Protect and serve. And yet be the same law enforcement officer who leads your precinct or your district in high rates of stops and frisks of young men of color. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to the principles of protecting and serving. Unconsciously, your behavior is inconsistent with that. The third characteristic that makes a bias implicit is that implicit biases are triggered through rapid and automatic mental associations that we make between people, ideas, and objects, and the attitudes and stereotypes that we hold about those people, ideas, and objects. And so, case in point, I want to do a quick exercise around the power of mental association. So in a minute, I'm going to flash a few words on the screen. And what I want to ask you to do is I want you to quickly reflect on and or call out the associations that you make with those words or that you believe the broader society makes with those words. And so this requires a little bit of call and response. So, government. Corporate. Suburbs. Boring. Subsidized housing. So the science of implicit bias would say that those associations that you just made, those aren't mere verbal associations. Those aren't mere mental associations. The science says that there are attitudes and behaviors that we attach to those associations. So imagine if, as part of my introduction, I came out here and I said, my name is Deshaw. I want to talk with you about something innovative. And I'm here representing local government. I used to work in corporate America. I was born and raised in subsidized housing, but I now live in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia. The science would suggest that for many of you, for those who said that your automatic mental association with government is corrupt, or your automatic mental association with corporate is greed, you would receive me through that filter oftentimes at the unconscious level. And it would color for you every single word that comes out of my mouth. So that's how implicit bias works. These rapid and automatic mental associations that shape and mold behavior every single day, oftentimes in ways that we're not even aware of, oftentimes in ways that do harm to others. So there are three reasons why focusing on implicit bias at this particular moment in time.
Introducing Grammarly like you've never seen before, your all-in-one writing essential. This
is important, and why I believe that a focus on implicit bias can help move this country forward. So, number one, an implicit bias focus gives us a much more expansive diagnosis of the challenges that we face in this country with respect to difference. What do I mean? We know from the work of esteemed scholars Mazarine Banaji and Anthony Greenwald that a significant amount of the harm being experienced and transmitted in this country with respect to racial bias and other lines of difference, we know that a significant amount of that harm stems from implicit forms of bias in addition to explicit forms of bias. Yet the majority of the tools that we use to address bias are designed to address explicit forms, not the implicit. So in essence, what we have in this country is a mismatch, a disconnect between how we diagnose challenges around difference and how we treat them. An implicit bias approach gives us a much more expansive diagnosis and a much more expansive toolbox. And my belief is that if we get the diagnosis right, we will get the treatment right. If we continue to get the diagnosis wrong, we will get the treatment. Number two, implicit bias is both predictive and it's preventive. Predictive in the sense that a person can go to the website for Project Implicit, take any one of the online implicit association tests, and receive a test result that can serve as a predictor of discriminatory behavior. It's preventive in the sense that there are emerging and promising strategies coming out of the science community that suggest with internal motivation and habitual practice, we can do things to reduce our vulnerability to act on our biases. And I believe that that is what the country needs right now. We need a prevention approach around issues of bias and difference versus an emergency room response. Right now, we have an emergency room response. We wait for stuff to happen, then we rush to the emergency room. We need a prevention approach, and implicit bias gives us that. Lastly, and number three, implicit bias, or an implicit bias approach, helps to reduce the shame and the shaming that's associated with talking about and addressing issues of bias. Author and researcher Brené Brown draws an interesting distinction between guilt and shame. She says, guilt says, I made a mistake and I can do something about it. Shame says, I am a mistake. This is who I am. I'm a horrible human being. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to always be this way. And what I want to submit to you is that my belief is that one of the biggest challenges that we have in this country and how we address issues of bias is that we engage in self-shaming, and if we're honest, sometimes we intentionally and unintentionally shame others. And my belief is that as long as we continue to do that, human beings would never feel the motivation that they need to do the self-change work or the broader societal change work that we need to do. An implicit bias approach addresses this because it makes the central question not are you racist or not racist, are you sexist or not sexist. An implicit bias approach makes the central question, how do we get our actions and behaviors, how do we align our actions and behaviors with our consciously held egalitarian beliefs, or at least for those people who do hold egalitarian beliefs. And my belief is that many people do. So that's why this work is important at this particular moment in time. And in closing, I want to leave you with a quick idea. The late child psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner once said that every child needs at least one adult in his or her life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. Raise your hand if you've had that at any point in your life. And so you know what it feels like. My belief is that not only does every child need that, but every human being needs at least one other human being in their life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. And the only way that we're going to have that is if we do the internal change work that we need to do to make the external change work possible. Thank you very much.
That brings us to the implicit bias paradox. The issue with addressing implicit bias is that it requires a person to not do what they do not know they are doing, even though they are consciously making efforts not to do what they do not know they are doing. As we prepare to close this part of our presentation with a few strategies to reduce the influence of implicit bias. One is to raise awareness of implicit bias. Individuals can only work to correct for sources of bias that they are aware exist. Simply knowing about implicit bias and its potentially harmful effects on judgment and behavior may prompt individuals to pursue corrective action. Although awareness of implicit bias in and of itself is not sufficient to ensure that effective debiasing efforts take place, it is a crucial starting point that may prompt individuals to seek out and implement the types of strategies listed throughout this presentation. Another is to seek to identify and consciously acknowledge real group and individual differences. The popular colorblind approach to egalitarianism, that is, avoiding or ignoring race, lack of awareness of and sensitivity to differences between social groups, fails as an implicit bias intervention strategy. Colorblindness actually produces greater implicit bias than strategies that acknowledge race. Cultivating greater awareness of and sensitivity to group and individual differences appears to be a more effective tactic. However, mandatory training or other imposed pressure to comply with egalitarian standards may elicit hostility and resistance from some types of individuals, failing to reduce implicit bias. And finally, is the need to routinely check thought processes and decisions for possible bias. Individuals interested in minimizing the impact of implicit bias on their own judgment and behaviors should actively engage in more thoughtful, deliberative information processing. When sufficient effort is exerted to limit the effects of implicit biases on judgment, attempts to consciously control implicit bias can be successful. To do this, individuals must possess a certain degree of self-awareness. They must be mindful of their decision-making processes rather than just the results of decision-making. Finally, I want to close with this. Officer safety and bias reduction are not competing priorities. They operate in different timeframes and reinforce professional performance. In immediate threat situations, officer safety, lawful control, and tactical decision-making come first. In discretionary and investigative situations, officers have time to apply bias reduction strategies, gather information, interpret behavior, and exercise bias-free discretion. Preparation prevents paralysis. Bias mitigation occurs through training, standardized decision anchors, articulation, supervision, and after-action review, not hesitation in dangerous moments.